All right, so I am Geo, and I guess I'm the USA team lead for endcoronavirus.org, and I self-describe myself as a cultural philosopher. So I try and think deeply about wisdom and truth and knowledge and what is the appropriate way to approach the world at sort of a cultural, philosophical, and intergenerational level.
Okay.
Who's next?
I can go next. My name is Sriram. I've been in tech for the last decade, in India, Southeast Asia, in Europe now, and through a sequence of events precipitated by the crisis, I have arrived at this point where I'm beginning to understand that for us to truly build a more truthful society, we need transformation of some sort, and perhaps now is the time we must find ways to ignite it.
Namaste. So I'm Spencer Wells. I'm a population geneticist. I have a PhD in population genetics. I have worked in virology. I've worked in immunology. I studied HLA variation at Stanford Medical School for 3 years in the mid-90s. Know a fair amount about virology, immunology, epidemiology, in addition to human population genetics. More recently, I launched the consumer genomics industry. So if you've ever done one of those spit tests that you order, I kind of invented that, and have started several tech companies, including a dog DNA testing company called Embark Veterinary. So doing 23andMe for dogs. And Wojcicki is actually, an investor in the company. But anyway, so that's kind of my background. I come from this kind of hybrid. I'm an author as well. I publish books. So I'm like a storyteller, scientist, tech person. And so I have, somewhat different eclectic perspectives on what's going on right now.
Very interesting. I especially appreciate the storyteller and all side of that.
Storytelling is how we make sense of the world.
Exactly true.
If we don't create narratives, we have no way of making sense of the events that happen randomly in our lives.
Absolutely.
So I guess, Spencer, we should probably start by just asking you, what is your general perspective on COVID-19?
The world is in trouble, this is not like the 1918 flu pandemic. To me, I've done other interviews. I literally just hopped off another podcast interview about this, about the economic effects, but the world has not seen something like this since the Black Plague in the 17th century. So the Black Plague actually lasted over several centuries, which doesn't bode well for the current pandemic. But, the last big outbreak was in 1666 in London. Half of the European population was killed. And, it had an utterly earth-shattering effect on European society. To me, that is my perspective as somebody who is, at heart a historian, although I've studied science and have my degrees in science. This is something no one has any cultural memory of. It's something you have to go back to history books to get a perspective on. And so that's my perspective. This is not like 1918. This is a weird combination of, it's so much like the Black Plague in so many ways, although the mortality rate's not going to be nearly as high, but society is much more fragile now. Nassim Taleb is a friend, and, I talked to him about this, and he's obviously written a lot about it. We've created this interconnected global culture that is so reliant on everything working in exactly the right way all the time that if anything is disrupted, it gets really scary really fast. And that's why I liken it to the Black Plague rather than the 1918 pandemic, where, you know, the world, number one, in 1918, the world was coming out of a world war. It was the end of, you know, an era of imperialism, aristocracy, European hegemony, et cetera, et cetera. The world was kind of prepared for revolution. The Russian Revolution was happening at that time. And, you know, so it was a shock, but it wasn't a shock in the way it is now, where we've had 30 years of Fukuyama's, you know, post-historical era, end of history and the last man, as he wrote about in, I think, 1991, after we, you know, beat off the Soviet Union and, you know, there was no threat to liberal democracy anymore. You know, it's, this kind of existential crisis does not come around very often. I find it, again, as a student of history and you know, epidemiology and biology and evolutionary genetics, to be utterly fascinating, but it's scary as hell.
Yeah, I agree with you kind of on the Black Plague. I don't see this as probably going to be quite catastrophic. I think that there is definitely a risk of that, but I think we've got enough knowledge and hopefully enough people working 100-hour weeks that we can push through the danger zone and come out the other side. And hopefully a better
So what's
place
the
as a
roadmap for that? Let me throw the questions back on you.
Sure.
What's the roadmap for how we come out the other side, in your opinion?
Right. So I think that the next month to 2 months are absolutely crucial. The kind of the core plan that I'm working from is to get the RO, the R0,
Or not? Yeah.
yeah, to get the R0 below 1 and as far below 1 as is humanely sustainable. Like whatever we can do to get that R0 down so that the disease stops spreading as soon as possible. And then
So okay, let me stop you there.
sure.
Given the antibody testing that has been done recently, the results have just come out in the last couple of days. R0 is way higher than we thought it was. How do you get R0 down below 1?
I am not entirely convinced by the antibody studies.
Okay.
I think
If
that
anything, they're an
I agree with you that if the antibody studies are accurate, we're actually way more fucked. Which is not the
perspective. Listen, I feel like we should all be honest here, because
yes,
this is to me, I'm not preaching doom and gloom because I want to scare the hell out of people. I'm trying to be as honest and forthright as possible because it is so serious, and I feel like nobody's getting real information in America. I feel like there's been a concerted effort to basically tamp down the bad news,
to pretend that it's not happening. Yeah, I 100% agree. Do you watch videos of like machines digging graves in New York City, and you're like, wow?
Yes. And I would know, but that's to be expected. I mean, come on.
Symbolically, though, it's a wow moment, right?
What scares the hell out of me are the Trump press conferences.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, are you freaking kidding me? Like injecting bleach, sticking a UV light up your fucking ass? Like, no way. Like, this is insane. We have such a chaotic lack of leadership from the top. That's why I'm so afraid for the US in particular, which, you know, I look at the Hopkins numbers every morning on the dashboard, and, you know, 4.2% of the world's population, a third of the world's cases. You know, regardless of what you think about testing, regardless of what you think about China's numbers, that's scary. That's really scary. And that is due to an utter failure of leadership on this, in my opinion.
Yes. And so our strategy at endcoronavirus.org is to go directly to governors with solutions and keep this like as local and deployable as possible to avoid as many road bumps on the red tape chaos side of deploying solutions.
And
Yeah.
I'll give you a non-US perspective. In India, we are doing something similar, which is for the last few weeks, we've been trying to reach district administrators because we know that this is a problem that can only be solved at the district level, and there are about 700 districts in the country. So we reach these administrators with the right set of protocols and procedures and SOPs that they could follow and generally implement at their level.
And Kerala, for instance, has done a fantastic job. Kerala
Yeah.
was the earliest hit state in India, and it's really managed to lock things down. I think, you know, there are lots of reasons. We can talk about humidity and heat and the fact that people in the wet tropics tend to live outside rather than inside in air conditioning and so on. I mean, I'm living in Indonesia now. We will live here for the foreseeable future. We've moved here from the US, from Austin, Texas, which is where I was based before. But, you know, Indonesia, I think, is also doing a pretty decent job. India, like places in South Asia, have not been hit nearly as hard as anywhere else in the world, despite the fact that everybody early on predicted that it was going to be just a fucking volcano of cases. The hardest hit place in Southeast Asia is Singapore, which is the most advanced country. And it's because everybody hangs out in shopping malls and in offices that are air conditioned. And it has a lot to do with, you know, what was discussed at the press conference a couple of days ago by the Homeland Security guy, I forget his name, but, you know, this idea that, you know, heat and humidity play a significant role in the survival of the virus on surfaces, in addition to the fact that there's Chinese data, you know, that came out over a month ago, back in late March, showing that if you are outside next to someone who is a carrier, you are 18 times less likely to catch it from them than if you're locked inside a room with them, which makes sense. I mean, we know this about the flu. We know this about the cold. I don't know why everybody is in such denial about basic epidemiological concepts having to do with this. Everyone's looking for like this magical solution or, you know, a magical exception. Like Sweden believes that their social system is going to save them. It's blown up in their faces. You know, oddly enough, South Asian countries in this are, I think, going to come out of it looking better than any other region, which is, thank God, you know, given the population size in this part of the world, it's a good thing, but it also doesn't bode well for Europe. I mean, you go down that list. I'm looking at it all the time. You know, so this is the latest numbers from Hopkins, 939,000 in the US, Spain, Italy, France, Germany, United Kingdom, Turkey, Iran. I mean, all of them have 6-figure infection rates, confirmed. Higher than that in reality if you look at those serology tests and take them at face value. You know, South Asia's doing pretty well. So I feel like, you know, for us at least, that's part of the reason we decided to stay in Indonesia.
Yeah, I try and spend.
I hate to be negative about the prospects for America and Europe. And, you know, I spent a lot of time on the last podcast I did, you know, just now, talking about the economic effects of this. But I don't see things playing out well for Europe and America over the next few years.
That's a real concern of mine. I've been kind of on that frame of like thinking. That's been my perspective from the beginning, from like middle of February when I became aware of this. I got on it late. I should have been on it by like late December, early January, and I was just too focused on sort of politics and sort of broader let's figure out how to save the world like perspective stuff, if you are aware of the term game B.
Yeah.
That was kind of what I was working on.
Listen, my attitude is that there is a Venn diagram that is being formed in terms of world responses. And scientists are one circle, and economists and policymakers are another circle, and the public is the third circle. And the intersection of those circles is so tiny right now. And believe me, the Trump administration is not in that sweet spot. We need to find a solution that fits all of those. And no one's thinking about it in those ways. The economists and policymakers are not talking, or they're not listening at least, to the scientists. The scientists don't understand the economics. I mean, nobody knows what fractional reserve rates are. It's a banking term, and the U.S. lowered their fractional reserve rate to zero in the latter part of March as a result of this, trying to pump more money into the economy, encouraging banks to loan more money. And banks have not loaned more money. If anything, they've hoarded cash, and there's going to be runs on banks as a result. But so scientists don't know about that basic kind of economic financial side of things. And then the general public is like, Trump told us to inject bleach in our veins. Is that going to cure us? And so like, who's at that Venn diagram sweet spot right now? That's what I want to know.
So you're gonna like some of the things that I've been working on. One of them is with Derek Van Gennep and Vincent Brunch, who are two members of the End Coronavirus team. We are putting together a list of respected experts. Not all of them are directly in virology, but everyone on the list either was warning the public by January or has been incredibly reliable, consistent, accurate, and aggressive about the seriousness of the situation since early February. And we are going to try and create a viral messaging campaign with these people to essentially ask them pertinent, important questions and get their answers anonymously and sort of aggregate or list, the answer categories and stuff to try and get these are the experts, these are the important questions, these are the answers, and these are the range of the answers.
I think that's good.
This is kind of an idea that Eric Weinstein floated, and so we're going to try and hit that network and hopefully get something to Joe Rogan on Joe Rogan, and from there, it's everybody knows about it.
And I think that's important. I mean, I want to encourage, like, I know Yanir. I gave a keynote at the Complexity Institute gathering a couple of years ago, and that's how he tapped me for this and got me involved in it. And I have tried to get the University of Texas to get involved in a testing initiative, and I have connections in Governor Abbott's office and all of that. And people don't want to do different things. They don't want to think outside the box. So whatever, I'm not going to be able to do that. But I think what you guys are doing is really important. What I want to encourage you to do is to think beyond the US, because this is a global phenomenon. And, the US is a unique case. Again, 4.2%, 1/3. Just those numbers speak to the truth of the situation. Like, nobody else is being hit like the US. And I have so many battles on Twitter with people when I post charts of exponential growth in the US, and they're like, oh, you have to account to, per capita population, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, no, it's a question of the shape of the curve. But beyond that, it's just like the US is it's a unique case in this. And I understand, obviously it's the world's most powerful country, most powerful economy, and everyone looks to the US for leadership, or they did, because I feel like this is going to change the global geopolitical and economic situation significantly, and it's all going to move to Asia. But anyway, I encourage you to get input from people in Asia, because Asian countries have a very different approach to this, and the people living in Asia, I think, I've seen it firsthand in Indonesia. Jokowi, the president of Indonesia, announced that, it's Ramadan here now. It just started 2 days ago. And, historically there's something called the mudik, which is, everybody decamps from typically there are a lot of workers who come from small villages in Java, and they're working in Jakarta, and they go back to their villages and spend time with their families because Ramadan is like a total downtime. But he did a total lockdown. Like, you can't take a plane, you can't take a boat, you can't travel between provinces here. And everybody is wearing masks, and everybody is practicing social distancing. They're all at least 2 meters apart. I don't see any evidence of that from what I read about in America. I mean, I see people out on beaches in Florida. I see Georgia reopening. I see people in Houston going to restaurants, elected officials. It's really scary, but the rest of the world is doing a much better job. And I feel like, to the extent that you want to provide helpful, proactive guidelines, look to places outside the US, because the US is really, pardon my French, fucking this up.
Yeah.
A lot of us who are on the India efforts have shared that view. Absolutely. We see a lot of Indian district states taking it a lot more seriously. I'm not saying that's all we need to do, because even in India, there are a lot of freak events that keep happening in every province. But in general, we do see the level of seriousness that's coming right from the top to be far higher.
Well, honestly, in Asia, what I'm seeing, and you're probably seeing this as well, and unfortunately this plays into the BJP's nationalist, attitude. But, you have these huge Muslim gatherings of 10, 15, 50, 100,000 people in the case of Malaysia. And so people come together and they pack into a tiny space and they pass on the virus to each other, and then they disperse and go back home. That's how all of these cases have entered Indonesia, pretty much. That's how so many of them have spread in India as well. Religion has to be changed, at least during this pandemic. And I respect everyone's religion. I'm not personally religious myself, but we're living in a Muslim country now. And we respect the fact that people have Ramadan and they want to pray and everything else. That's totally cool. But don't pack tens of thousands of people into a mosque to do it. Don't pack people into mega churches in the deep South in America to do it. It's just insane right now.
Yeah. One of the things, going back to R naught and some of the data about the disease, because I think this is an important conversation and an important message for people to hear, is that there's a lot of confusion about these numbers and what they mean. And so kind of the way that I've been framing it for myself is that there are 2 death rate numbers that we need to think about as separately but intertwined. One is what I have kind of technicalized as a term, the raw death rate. And that's the death rate without medical intervention. And that's about 8%.
Well, what I have been telling people is that there is no across the board CFR or IFR.
Yeah.
It depends very much on where you live.
Yeah,
so
it does.
If you're living in a slum in Ecuador, it could be 20%, 30%. And if you're living in a rich part of Heidelberg in Germany, it could be 0.2%. It's the same freaking virus, but it depends very much on the circumstances. And what people have to remember is that the CFR, which is the initial estimate of mortality rate, is always going to be elevated relative to the true mortality rate, because we don't know the actual number of people who are infected. And so, the number that the testing initially, it has to be, in any outbreak, you have to be focused on people with symptoms, and that's it's a biased sample. Yeah, and so you're selecting for people who are likely to have it. And so now, as we're getting this serological data, whether you believe the actual numbers or not, and we can talk about some of the technical reasons why you may or may not want to believe the actual numbers, but we know that the actual number of infected people is far higher than the number of people who've been tested and confirmed. And so the death rate, the mortality rate in a society that has uniform access to high quality healthcare is relatively low. I mean, listen, if you live in Norway, if you live in Iceland, you know, this is not a serious disease. If you live in Mississippi and you haven't been to see a doctor in 10 years because you can't afford health insurance, and you're obese and you have type 2 diabetes and you have COPD because you've been a smoker for 30 years, this is a really serious disease. If you're over 65 and you live in Spain or Italy, which skews older because nobody has kids there because their economy has been bombed for 30, 40 years, everybody lives with their parents and nobody actually forms families on their own until they're in their 40s when they can afford to. No, I mean, societies that skew older, same issue. It depends on the population you're talking about. It depends on the culture you're talking about. It depends on your access to healthcare. And Americans don't realize, I think Americans on the coasts, people who live in Boston, New York, DC, San Francisco, Portland, LA, Seattle, don't realize that parts of America are much worse off than parts of the third world. You go to parts of rural Mississippi and Louisiana and Tennessee and West Virginia, and they're way worse off than where I am. Indonesia, like we have a very modern health clinic just down the road. There are lots of expats who've chosen to stay here in their vacation homes rather than go back to Australia or Germany. No, I mean, America is, because of the disparities in America, it's you can't deal with a single number. You really have to contextualize it within the local population and the region.
Yeah, I 100% agree. That's why I was trying to bring up the number. The specifics of the number, it's really hard to estimate because there's confounding factors. Like as people start to die, your viral load goes up and then more people start to die. And then you go from like 8 as like a baseline number, which is like as conservative as estimate as I can make for this number. And you can go basically all the way up, because as you just get sicker and then you're around sick people, you get sicker because there's more viral load. Your body can't fight it off. It becomes a completely different situation to, I'm sick, but I'm not exposed to like more virus because I'm like, one of the reasons why people like medicine, like sometimes killed people, especially historically, is being bedridden in a confined room without airflow is really bad for your immune response and also for your viral load. And so one of the first true innovations was, hey, we put people in mountain air where they breathe fresh air, bundled up so that they're warm, but they're out in the open. That was a huge medical innovation. And so like those are really basic things that actually make significant difference.
Why do you think D.H. Lawrence moved to northern New Mexico when he caught tuberculosis? There was no treatment at that point, but they went there because it was a healthier environment. There's something to that.
Yeah. And so a lot of people are talking about is the death rate 3%, 2%, 1%, 0.5%. It's like that's a completely different conversation. You're talking about standard of care death rate. In other words, we as a like medical institution, or however you want to frame that, modern science is going all out to save people, and 2% still die. That's a different number to this many people die.
I want to say something here.
Yeah,
I just want to say something here. I think we're discussing the mechanics of exactly what that death rate might be, but this looks like an ethics issue at some level, right? It takes a certain level of truth seeking to integrate the three angles that you mentioned earlier, Spencer. You said the economists, the scientists, and the people in the government administration not seeing eye to eye, but it's also important to look at this problem holistically and say, look, what is the truth here and what is the right thing to do? What is the right course of action? And if we don't clarify what that shared morality needs to be at this point in this atmosphere of panic, a lot of people are falling to their base instincts of being foot soldiers of the institutional thinking that they have probably been raised in.
I agree with you. And listen, on the earlier podcast, I was like, I was asked, so how do we get out of this? And I'm like, well, what do you mean by get out of this? Because I don't think that what you're asking is what I'm thinking. I don't see this ending for years. Herd immunity for this coronavirus is not going to happen, not anytime soon. A vaccine is not going to be easy because it's got a huge RNA genome and there's so much variation out there. There are multiple strains circulating already, and we already know that people who've been infected can be reinfected. The WHO just released a story yesterday saying that we should not be issuing immunity passports because we know that reinfections can occur. So, you know, this is a different thing. This is more like the flu virus. It's like a very deadly version of the flu virus. And so, you know, what does getting out of this mean? Well, it means assigning people to risk pools. You know, risk pools based on factors we know about that, you know, honestly, medicine isn't that sophisticated. You know, those of us who work in the genomics world have been trying to make it more sophisticated. We've been trying to get them to focus on causes rather than symptoms. But medicine, since the time of the Greeks, has been focused on treating symptoms. Symptoms become onerous enough that you go to see a specialist, you're willing to pay some money, they treat the symptoms, and hopefully they cure the underlying disease. You know, this is a case where, you know, people are, we know what the basic risk pools are if you're old. So if you're over 65, you're in danger, especially if you're over 70. And we know from the New York infection data that if you're obese, you're highly susceptible to this and you're likely to be hospitalized. That's unfortunately a lot of people in America. You know, before we even get into the reasons why healthy 27-year-old triathletes can crash and burn from this, and those are genetic reasons. So this, you know, is kind of my area of expertise more recently. But until we assign risk pools and we determine who's allowed to come out of lockdown to restart the economy, and I want to restart the economy. I'm a small business owner. I mean, I don't like the fact that, you know, we're hemorrhaging money and that I'm watching the economy crash and burn. No one wants that. But I also don't want to see a lot of people die. The only way to do it is intelligently, and it's to create those risk pools. And the two obvious ones are, you know, people who are obese and people over 65. Unfortunately, that's about 3/4 of the US population, because America is nearly 50% obese as of this year. And we have a lot of baby boomers who are retiring. And so if those are the people who cannot leave lockdown right now because we don't understand enough about how to stop viral infections and, you know, how to create a vaccine to protect them, that's a big hit. Like, societies have issues when 3/4 of the people are locked in their homes indefinitely, not for 6 months, not for a year, for 5 years, maybe. Until we have a series of vaccines that slowly start to build up some sort of herd immunity. It's not going to be a single vaccine. And I don't think, this is where I talk about that Venn diagram. It's like, you know, people in the science world are talking about stuff like this, but people in the economics world, and certainly not the general public, like, they assume there's going to be some magic bullet vaccine, or that, you know, there's going to be herd immunity that appears miraculously and saves everyone and saves their jobs. It's not going to happen. It's a very bleak outlook at the moment. It's a long, hard battle. This is like going into a world war, and people have to accept that.
Yes. We're at time. I think we've really having a great conversation. Do you want to just drop onto another call and continue? Or you want to go to bed, Spencer?
Yeah, it is midnight here, so I'm going to drop off.
Okay, thank you. This is fantastic conversation, I think.
Yeah, great talking to you guys. And sorry to like drop that you know, existential crisis bomb at the end. But
I am on the existential crisis end of this. Sharam is on the existential crisis end
Absolutely.
of it.